Welcome to another episode of Muslims and Mental Health. Today we're going to talk about preparing for Ramadan with Imam Mark Manley, who is the Imam and Religious Director at Middle Ground in Upland, California. Mark is an original native to Detroit, Michigan, and he's been in California for about the last 3 years or so, and I've had the pleasure of knowing him for about 20 or more years. So I'm very happy to have him here today in studio, and we're going to get started with also one other additional note you should know about Mark is that he has mad skills when it comes to cooking, and he has a hashtag called Shake Chef on Instagram.
That's right, yeah.
So the technophobe I am, I don't really know all those things, but anyway, Instagram. So let's get started. I want to ask you about Ramadan, how we can prepare for it mentally, physically, spiritually, all of those great things for the coming month.
So in some ways it can even maybe tie that into the Instagram thing, right? So I've noticed a trend over, several years, kind of with the advent of social media, that as Ramadan approaches, that many Muslims will start to think about like, well, this is the pre-suhoor or pre-dawn shake you should have, and you should do this and that, and or what you should do after to recover. And so much of our, I think, sort of thinking and imagining is other than the fast, which sometimes I wonder, like, do Muslims not want to fast? I understand that it isn't easy, but there's an incredible lesson to be learned in doing things that are always, not always easy or always pleasing, right? So if I would start, I would say, with the kind of like social media generation, I use social media, but I don't consider myself to be of that generation, is to one, Ramadan is about your relationship with God. And if you're going to have a relationship with God that is other than like with Santa Claus, right, which is just about, being nice to get what you want, then I think it's important to realize that life may require you, God may put things in your life that are not always easy, convenient, and therefore I encourage Muslims to really think about, it's fine if you want to have your special little shake, right? But I think once we start off down that road, we are really leaving the spirit of what Ramadan is all about. We know the narration from the Prophet ﷺ where he says that Allah says what, Ramadan is done for my sake and I reward for it, right? So it's really about having, rejuvenating a very important, rejuvenating your important relationship with God in your life. And it's a reminder of, not only for poor people, because we think about, people who don't eat, it's just also a reminder of, this life is temporary also. So I think it's important for us to get back to a religious Ramadan versus a social media Ramadan, which is about, hashtagging and being with your friends. That's all great. It's certainly wonderful to come together and pray the Taraweeh prayer together, but still remembering that, you're there not for the selfie or the hashtag or the fast is the main component that actually God wants you to experience, right? During that month. So I would say also encourage Muslims to think experientially, right? What is, so you can have an embodiment of Ramadan.
Yeah, so I hear what you're saying. We have reached a point where basically with doing the right protein shakes and the right combination, you can basically eliminate the hunger,
right? At
least in the shorter days. And so what I hear you saying is kind of like, maybe that's not a good idea, or
right. If God has prescribed for us, kutiba alaykum as-siyam, if God has prescribed for us a month in which we would feel hunger, right? Then why do we want to go out of our way to not feel hunger, right? And I think that shows how much our kind of pre-rational thinking has been hijacked from the time and culture that we live in, which anything that causes us inconvenience, that doesn't feel good, we gotta nix that out of our life, right? And if that comes to the fasting, so I'll be a Muslim and I'll observe the fast, but I will do everything within my power to actually minimize experiencing the fast, right? And I think that's I mean, you're just not getting it,
Yeah.
right?
You know, that's so cool because, you know, you just reminded me of something that, you know, one of the things that we say is an additional risk factor for the poor in terms of mental illness is an inability to have impulse control, to delay gratification.
Right.
And it just seems to be disproportionately affecting the poor.
Sure.
But it does lead to more mental illness in that segment of the population. So, but to me, what you're saying sounds like poverty of thinking.
It is.
Or
It
poverty
is.
of heart.
It's certainly an impoverished spirituality, an impoverished form of thinking. And I think, again, that really shows how much Muslims have surrendered themselves to the cultural context of which they live in, of which they are purely just the receptacles of whatever's produced from that culture, whether that is products or whether there's modes of thinking. And that I think one of the contributions Muslims could give, other than, you know, medicine and taxi driving in America, is to, you know, remind people of the importance of not always being in a state of pure happiness. In fact, you know, when you're given a vaccination, unless you're one of those crazy people that doesn't believe in vaccinations, right? But when you're, the idea of a vaccination is to actually give you a small dose of the thing that will cause you harm, and it stresses your body a little bit, that actually makes your body stronger, builds the antibodies, right? So in the same way, I think it's called like hormesis or something like this. So the Ramadan, it stresses you physically, spiritually, in these ways that actually will then make you better. So some Muslims that are, you know, wondering why they don't maybe progress in their religion was like, well, did you spend your whole entire Ramadan doing everything to countermand or counteract the Ramadan experience?
I like that.
So
yeah, because we say the same thing about therapy, right? It's like it's a dosage
Yes.
every time you go to a therapeutic setting, right? And if you think of Ramadan that way, in a therapeutic way,
it is.
it's
right.
your dose.
But not all therapy, just like, you know, and just like psychological therapy, it's not all feel good.
Right.
Right.
No, I tell my clients all the time, I'm going to challenge you. I'm here to challenge
Right.
you. Otherwise, you're wasting your money, and I don't waste your money like that.
And
Yeah.
you won't benefit,
Yeah.
right? That's the thing. So I would say, you know, that would be probably the biggest reminder or maybe takeaway to give people, is to, you know, just jump in the pool. Just embrace it. Embrace the 16-hour fast, right? In your air-conditioned home and office and, you know, car and
Right.
your abundance of food. You know, I mean, when we really think about it, you know, especially living here in America, not all Muslims in America are wealthy by any standard, but just compare to just what are the people in you know, certain parts of East Africa who are already in a famine? They're going to have a Ramadan famine.
Right, so that's a good point, because we do have vulnerable populations around the world right now that
Right.
are experiencing famine.
Or they're going to have the war They're going to have the
Yeah.
war Ramadan, right?
Yeah.
The Syrian people are going to have the war and extermination Ramadan. The Rohingya are going to have the genocide Ramadan, right? So I've tended to move away from this soft approach with people. Like, look, you know, you need to kind of buck up a little bit and just jump in the pool, right?
Yeah.
Just jump in, and once you get over the shock of it, right? It actually, if you give it a moment, you might find some other nuances or flavors or, you know, aromas about Ramadan, proverbially speaking, that you will actually enjoy. You know, it's like if you only eat junk food, then you will only develop a palate for junk food, right?
Yeah.
So the first time you give somebody that's on a diet of junk food, you give them like an apple, they're like, eh. You know, right?
Yeah.
But if you do that with a person, when they come back to the Snickers bar, it's like, man, what is this, right? So just encouraging people to think of it maybe from that point of view.
Yeah, Ramadan has always been hard for me.
It's hard for me. Like, people
It's
think
always
because...
been hard. I mean, like, it's you know, when people say, you know, they some things they like and are easier, they prefer, you know.
Right.
Ramadan has always been hard for me. Not that I don't enjoy its coming. I actually look forward to it every year. It's just always hard for me, and there's a reason. It's because I find comfort in food.
Sure. Yeah.
So, you know, it's hard, and I think that. But I really like your points. It's going to help me, I think, this year too. So, what are some of the things non-Muslims should keep in mind who supervise Muslims about this time of year, and or a neighbor who is a neighbor to a Muslim? Like, what are advices you have for them that they, should consider and keep in mind?
Well, if you see them eating or drinking during the daytime, you should report them. um,
Well, that doesn't always apply to women.
That's true, right? If it's a woman, she may have some excuse, right? I mean, in some ways, I don't think you have to necessarily go out of your way to do anything. I mean, if you're having an office party, maybe you'll understand why somebody would choose to, withdraw, or if they go, hey, why aren't you having the cheese dip, right? So just be aware that maybe during that month. But I would say that to make them aware, Muslims should actually communicate openly, with their coworkers and say, hey, look, I'm not going to be eating or drinking during the daylight hours. So if I'm not going out to lunch with you during this month, or if I seem like I'm a little bit more withdrawn, don't take it personal. I'm just maybe focusing on some different things. So I would say, if anything, don't put that responsibility upon them to be aware of what it is, and come out of the closet, so to speak, with this, with your Muslimness, and just say, hey, this is what I'm doing, and don't feel you have something to apologize for, or that it's strange or obscure. I mean, you go to Barnes and Nobles, there's a whole section now, the 5-2 diet, right? What is the 5-2 diet?
I have no idea. What is the 5-2?
It's this new phenomenon that people have discovered, in the West, that if you fast 2 days a week, you gain all these like great benefits,
Actually,
right?
I think I did buy a book about that.
Yeah. I think it's like Michael Mosley or something, this British doctor who discovered that if you fast, like essentially
The
the sunnah fast, right? So just tell them like, hey, I'm doing this, so that they're aware and that they know.
And just quickly before we go to break, could you also describe, because I find that a lot of times people who are not Muslim will get acquainted with, Ramadan, but they think it's a fixed part of the year. So could you just talk about the lunar calendar, like how Ramadan comes and goes?
Right. So, Muslims, like Orthodox Jews and a few other religious traditions, follow their own calendar, which is lunar based. So typically the Hijri calendar will move back, or any lunar calendar, when compared to the Gregorian calendar, will move backwards anywhere between maybe like 10 to 14 days a year. So that's why every year it seems like, Ramadan came early. No, it didn't come early. It's actually, it's just following a lunar cycle. We tend to be very detached from the natural world, in the Western, in some of the Western nations. So it can be somewhat odd that, hey, Christmas for us comes every year, the 25th. Right. Why is it, right? So, yeah, just explaining that that's the natural cycle of the moon, actually.
And so this year it looks like we'll commence Ramadan around the 25th or 26th of May, right?
Yeah, I think pretty much the last week of May is when, inshallah, should start, and it'll also probably end roughly towards the last week of June. Yeah.
Great.
So hot. At least for us here in Southern California, it's good.
Yeah.
It's going to be hot, but
probably be humid in Michigan and places like that.
Yeah, that's why I live in Southern California.
Yeah. So great, this is a great start. We need to take a break for our sponsor, so we're going to do that now, and we'll return in just a minute or so. Thank you. welcome back to Muslims and Mental Health. Today I'm with Imam Mark Manley, and we're discussing how to prepare for Ramadan. We're going to continue on now with the question, what do you think the benefits are, as you see them, of Ramadan? I mean, you've talked about a little bit of the,
Right. No, I mean, I think, the benefits for Ramadan are certainly about self-discipline. And self-discipline can, I think, take on many different forms. There's obviously the physical self-discipline of denying yourself food and water, being able to control your urges, and that's certainly great. But I think there's also the self-discipline of not focusing on the world as if it is the beginning and ending of everything, right? I mean, I think we as Muslims believe that one day the world won't be here, right?
Right.
That all of this
I hope
eventually
so.
will all come to an end. I mean, just,
I hope that people believe that. That's what I mean.
well, I mean, do we believe that like a fairy tale, or do we believe it,
Yeah.
right? I've even at Middle Ground, I've tried to really focus on teaching from an embodiment point of view, right? Where, okay, it says this in the book, or it says this in the Sunnah, but do we embody it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the great benefits is that you tame the body physically, but for me, I see that actually as a secondary. The primary is that you tame your attachment to the world, because the world is not permanent, it's temporal. And I think at the back of your mind, again, talking about some of that pre-rational stuff, is that you're training yourself for having to meet God, right? I mean, one of the things that actually Allah chastises people about in the Quran is that not that they sinned, right? He said, if you sin, Allah yaghfiru dhunuba jami'an, Allah forgives all sins, right? But the one thing He chastises them on is that you forgot your meeting with me, and He said, in response to that, it's one of the few sins that Allah actually takes retribution back. Like, you forgot me, inna nasinakum, I'm going to forget you, right? So it also trains us to remember God, which I think is, even when it comes to the prayer, right? God says, "Wala dhikrullahi akbar," right? Even that the remembrance of God is greater, because otherwise you're not even going to do the prayer, right? So, from an embodiment kind of principle, from living it, I think one of the great benefits is to train your body, your mind, your soul, your appetites, not just restriction for restriction's sake, but restriction because this life isn't permanent.
Yeah, that's so important. It almost makes me want to cry hearing you talk about that, because it's so relevant to our community right now. I think it was Brother Abdullah bin Hamid Ali who recently put up something about secular Muslims, right?
Right.
Like, are we going to be Muslim or are we going to be secular Muslims?
Right.
And it really hit me, just as almost as profoundly as your words right now, because this is responsible for a lot of the imbalance that we see in our community right now. Is that inability to detach and see what's real versus, what is
or
the
even
show?
imbalance in the
what's
world, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
even just beyond the Muslim community. I mean, look at why do we have almost incredible environmental degradation, right? I was listening to this book called Garbology. I really highly recommend. It's about this guy that was studying the garbage practices, particularly in the United States. And I mean, when you look at this sort of very nafsi, selfish kind of culture, and look, I'm from here, right? So I'm not some sort of Western bashing, hating, right? But I'm critical of those things that need to be critical of.
Right.
He said, we're producing garbage at such a rate that it's insane. Like, at some point we're just going to be like a nation of garbage, right? And part of that is we have no conscience. Like, you get something from Amazon, you just toss the box away, you get this, and we're fed some of these lies saying like, oh, you can recycle this. And he said, actually, like, the vast majority of stuff that says recycle truthfully isn't even recyclable, or it doesn't biodegrade like they say, right? So I say all that to, I mean, it's this excessive attachment to the world, right? As if the world is always going to be here, or as if the world is endless, right? God's mercy is endless. Jannah is boundless, right? This world has actually boundaries drawn around it, right? And I think Ramadan is a great opportunity to remind ourselves on all levels, physically, spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, that this life has boundaries and limits. Within that, we should, live happy, good lives and whatnot, but that doesn't mean every moment is happiness, right?
Well, happiness is a temporary emotion. It just comes in spurts, and this is one of the things that we need to get with.
Right.
I've been, using it a lot because it comes up a lot. That people really need to understand that this is a temporary emotion. It's not expected to be long-lasting.
Right.
Sadness actually is expected to be long-lasting.
Right.
And it has its own positive purpose of helping let go of things. We have to rearrange the furniture around a lot of different things. But
I think a short view versus a long arc of happiness, right? I mean, it's like going to the gym. I don't know about anybody else, but when I go to the gym, I'm not happy. I feel like I'm dying. I feel like I'm killing myself, right? But when you see the results, right, later, you feel happy, right, or at different times. So I think it's also just having a different way of conceiving happiness other than just the moment. That's my problem of this philosophy of live in the moment, right? Well, if you want to live in the moment and you want to be happy in every moment, then that becomes actually kind of problematic. I think that creates
you have to
selfishness.
distinguish between living in the moment and being present. Being present is really important.
Right, exactly.
And speaking of, before we get to our fun questions, I do want to add one more question to you, because Ramadan is also a time where we see often children are silenced in the masjid, right? There's not space for them, and they're left out of that process. And then we're scratching our heads asking, well, why aren't they there when they're adults, right? Or like when they're young people, teenagers, why have they left the masjid, right?
Why don't they want to be Muslim anymore?
Right. And so what can you say about that?
Well, I mean, one, I'm that imam that quit his job at a masjid, just trying to say. And I quit over some, very particular reasons. Not all of it was due to my, treatment personally at the masjid. It was also just due to a complete conflict of vision, right? So one, I think the fact that, it isn't just that it's the grumpy uncles and the aunties. I mean, they are though. But what's behind their grumpiness is that they have no vision, right? And this is what is crippling the Muslim community, is that we invest in buildings, we invest nothing in people, right? I mean, if I wanted to build a masjid tonight, I could get the money, guaranteed, right? If I need $2 million, I'd have the money tonight, right? If I wanted to hire an assistant director, I'd never get the money, right? And it's predominantly going to be people, right? I mean, I think as converts, we can speak to that along the way, it wasn't the chandeliers and the Turkish carpets that, wanted us to convert. And it wasn't only just like, Tawheed and all this other abstract stuff. I mean, it was, but there was also probably some people and some beneficial experiences with people that maybe helped us to feel or see a certain way, right? And then after the conversion, it's those negative feelings that are often, it ain't about the chandelier, like, man, that chandelier just ain't right. That doesn't go with the room. It's not that. It's not the feng shui of the masjid that's right. It's the people.
Right.
So I think the way to control the people is to invest in human resources. I mean, at Middle Ground, like, kids come to Jumu'ah, and I actually have to tell people, it's okay. Like, let that kid just do his thing. Like, you're an adult, focus, I mean, my khutbah is generally only like 20 minutes long anyway. It's not long. If the kid is running, like, I tell people, stop shushing the children. You're doing sometimes irrevocable harm.
Right. That negative association.
Right. So what's nice is that now I've kind of like, I mean, for the younger generation, they're like, oh man, this is great. So the young parents come with their kids and they like it. For the older aunties and uncles, like, they have actually come around after being coached a little bit to where you can still see like their hand like jerks a little bit when the kid starts to make noise, but then like the other hand is like, it's like, they're learning, they're making it, because I'm not being belligerent to them. I'm just saying, hey, look, you're out of here in another 10 or 15 years, right? If you want your kid to be here or your grandkid to be here, right? Stop that.
Yeah.
So it's also, I think, we need to make this a priority. But first off, the community has to have a vision. Right, and I think that's something that the vast majority of Muslim communities they have no vision. I know it sounds terribly harsh.
No.
But,
I'm just sitting here thinking, I'm a processor, so I'm sitting here thinking actually about my experiences as a child, as a Christian.
Sure.
Because I remember my grandmother, and she was just following the norms of the community, right? But you go to church, you dress up, you proper, and kids don't make noise, right?
Right.
And so if you were to move too much or speak when you weren't supposed to, you'd get
Sure.
like a little flick on the back or something
No, yeah.
to get in line, which is very similar, right?
But for us, we all know, this is so funny, Muslims love to, re-narrate this hadith or this tradition from the Prophet ﷺ when he heard the child crying, he didn't turn around and be like, hey man, somebody shut that kid up.
Yeah.
Or, either you or this kid is going to get a lashing. No, he just, okay, I'll shorten the prayer.
Yeah.
So he was compassionate about children. Matter of fact, there is nothing in any hadith about like, hey man, make that kid be quiet.
So it was working together.
Why, well, not just that, but if that is how he demonstrated how to deal with children, why do we not deal with children that way,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I think that also comes where we have to make our cultural practices be in conversation with the deen,
Yeah.
right? I think once we blur this line, I'm not against cultural expressions of Islam, but at the same time, that expression needs to be constantly in a conversation and kind of monitored, so that if we have slipped into a bad habit of silencing our children, we can go back to the religion and say, that isn't something we should be doing,
So, and as I would say, right, is it's being in relationship.
Yes.
And so, we want that relational aspect with the children, because that's what's going to bring them. That's what's going to make them invested in it. Mm-hmm. If they feel like, oh, my thoughts count here, how I see this space matters, then that's going to make a difference.
Right. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
For coming to discuss this topic with us. It's been really helpful. I've learned in sitting with you today. I think it's going to make my Ramadan even better this year. But I also want to transition to ask you some fun questions.
Okay. All right.
So on this time, I want to ask you, because we've had you here before, I don't want to
Right.
ask you the same questions. What is your favorite type of cultural production?
Well, I am a big movie fan. Like I have a crazy, 7.1 surround sound system actually in my house. Our brother came over the other day and he's like, man, I was like, this is like your house is shaking. I'm like, yeah, it's great, isn't it? I love movies, particularly, the more B-movie sci-fi it is, probably the better.
That's what I was going to ask you about genre.
Science fiction, definitely I'm a huge fan of. I'm a big book fan too. Like I have a fairly, I would say actually I do have a very good size home library. So I'm a voracious reader and I read about everything. I mean, not just things related to the deen, but
Garbology.
Garbology, yeah. So probably movies and reading are my two biggest.
Okay, cool. And what is the name or of your favorite movie or book?
Wow. So movie, it probably would be like a neck and neck tie between John Carpenter's They Live. John Carpenter's.
Is that a sci-fi movie?
No, I mean yes and no. It is kind of it's about aliens who take over the earth, but it's I would probably say two John Carpenter's films, They Live and Big Trouble in Little China.
Oh, okay.
And then
I think I've heard of that one.
probably like the original Star Wars movie in '77. So probably those. But I mean, there's so many. I mean, the original Alien, that was really great. I just watched Heat the other day, which was filmed here.
Yeah, that's Al Pacino.
And, Al Pacino and Robert De Niro. I hadn't watched that since it came out in like 95 or 97, right? And it held up really well. So that was good. So I love cinema,
Well, you're in the right place for it.
I know. I can transition from imam to, I don't know, maybe stunts. Maybe I could do some stunt work,
Inshallah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
This concludes another episode of Muslims and Mental Health. Again, if you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please contact us at nafshealertherapy@gmail.com, or you can join us on our adjunctive website at www.nafshealertherapy.wordpress.com. Thank you, and assalamu alaikum.